Hey all, welcome back. So, this is our day 9, and to begin with, the first thing I want to talk about is more on functions. So, we have already seen a couple of things that we can do with functions. The first thing I showed you was how to create a very simple box standard function using the def, the name, the empty brackets, and then the colon. And then within the body of the function you can do a bunch of things which will be carried out every single time you trigger or call the function like this. And the first type of function basically just helps you reduce the amount of the code you have to write when you have instructions that you want to execute repeatedly. Now, the next type of function we saw actually had something inside the brackets, and this something is an input which can be passed over when we call the function. So, in this case, 1, 2, 3 is the argument which gets passed into this parameter called something, and then it gets used within the body of the function. The second type of function, the function which allows for input, gives us the ability to modify the code in the function and to get it to do something different each time depending on what input was passed in. We are now onto the final sort of flavor functions, and these are functions which allow you to have an output once the function is completed. We start off with a simple function, and in this case you will notice that even though I'm actually not giving it any input, the inputs and the outputs are completely separate from each other. So this is a normal function that you have seen many times now, and within the body of the function I'm going to do some piece of calculation. Let's say I'm going to calculate what is 3 times 2, and then save it to a variable called result. Now, once that's done, I can use the output keyword which is written, and then after the keyword, I can put whatever it is I want to be the output of this function. So, in this case, the output is the result. And what that means is when I call the function later on and it runs, then it will go ahead and output this result, and it replaces these lines of code when this function was called. Now, that result is held in the code where the function was called, and I could save it to another variable. Result, of course, equals 3 into 2, then, and that means this output now equals 6. So this is what the code might look like. Somewhere I would define my function which has an output which you can tell by the return keyword. Now at some other point in my code I decide to call the function, and once that function executes, the return or whatever is outputted replaces the function call. And at the very end it means this variable output will store whatever the output is. Now we are going to create some function with outputs of our own. Let's start off by creating a new function which I'm going to call format name, and the reason is because this function is going to take a first name and a last name, and it's going to change those inputs even if it was lowercase or if it was all caps. It's going to change it into title case, something like this, where the first letter is capitalized in each word. To begin, I want to create this function and then go ahead and add 2 inputs to it. Alright, so all we have to do to add inputs to our function is just to put the names of these parameters inside the brackets. So now our function is able to take these parameters as inputs whenever this function gets called. The next step is we are going to convert these strings that get passed in, so it could be something like this, all lowercase, it could be all capitalized, or it could be kind of random, right? Like some are capitalized, some are not, but we are going to make it all uniform, so all of these are going to end up like this. Alright, so we want to go ahead and take this f name and then write a dot and then write title to convert it to title case. Once we have done that, then we are going to do the same with the L name. And if we go ahead and actually print this out. And of course, in order for the function to actually execute, we will have to call the function. So I'm going to put two inputs in here, one which is going to be just Sheikha all in lowercase, and then the second one is going to be Sheikha all in uppercase. And now when I run this code, you will see that the result is they both get converted to title case. In essence, this part of the code becomes whatever the previous value of f name is converted to title case. You might have spotted already that this title function actually has an output. It returns a version of the string where each word is title cased. Instead of simply just printing this, we can also capture it inside a variable. Let's create a new variable called formatted f name and also formatted l name. Now what's happening here is we are transforming this input f name turning into title case, and then once this function executes, it has an output, and that output replaces this part of the code, and then it gets sorted inside this variable. Now we can go ahead and print the final version of our function, which is going to use an f string to take the formatted f name and then add a space and then print out the formatted l name like this. Now, if I start out with my first name but all in strange sort of casing and then my last name in all caps, let's go ahead and hit run and see what happens. You can see that my first name gets converted to title the case, my last name gets converted to title case, and then the result is stored in formatted f name, and this result becomes stored in this l name, and they get printed and formatted like so. Now, instead of printing this result out, we could also return it as well. In the same way that this title function returns the output, replaces this part of the code, we can also do the same with our format name function. So let's delete the print function and go ahead and use a return instead. Now this formatted string becomes the output and as we mentioned before, what happens with functions with output is this output replaces the part of the code where the function was called. Now, if this is the string that we want to print, then all we have to do is just to save the output which replaces this part of the code inside a variable like this. And then all we have to do is just go ahead and print that formatted string. As you can see, when I run the code, the same thing happens. Now you might have alternatively just taken this function call and put it straight inside the print statement. That works exactly the same way. As I mentioned before, we have actually already been using functions that we didn't create that have all of these functionalities, right? For example, the len function takes an input and has an output. The input is going to be a string. My name, again, seem to be really obsessed with my name. So now this line of code is going to run this built-in len function, calculating the number of letters inside the input that we have given it, and then it's going to return the result as an output, which we can now capture inside a variable. This is the inputs, this is the function, and once this is completed, the return or whatever is after the return statement is going to replace this part of the code. Then the result or output then gets stored inside of this variable. So this returns keyword is really the most important thing in order to create a function that has an output, because everything that comes after it is going to replace what the function was called. Next, let's see what happens when a function has more than one return statement. When the computer encounters a line that has the word return on it, then it knows that this line is the end of the function. If I add a line of code after the return keyword, notice what happens when I run this code. It doesn't ever get executed, and this has because the because the return tells the computer that this is the end of the function and you should now exit the function. You can actually have multiple return keywords within the same function, and you can even have an empty return keyword. So just the return keyword without anything afterwards. So for example, we could check whether if the f name is equal to an empty string or the l name is equal to an empty string. I'm sorry. So this case it means that when we called it format name, maybe we didn't give it any inputs. For example, let's say that instead of just calling the function as it is, we actually used the input function. So what is your first name and what is your last name? Now, what happens is it will ask you for an input and it will take these two inputs and then call the function and return the formatted function to be printed. So now, in this case, it's possible that we might have just not given it a first name or not given it a last name, and it probably shouldn't go through these lines of code. But at this moment, it's still running this function, trying to get the title case from the empty string and then printing it. And I can prove this to you by just adding an extra word in here. So again, empty first name, empty last name, and then it's print result, and then of course nothing. How can we get it to bypass the rest of the code if the user typed in an empty first name or last name? Well, we could use what I mentioned before, an early return. So we could just write a return without anything afterwards, and this is going to escape the function. So it's basically going to terminate the function early. Now, this time if I leave an empty first name and last name, you will see it prints none because there is no output from this to print. Now, of course, it's probably safer to actually return something that tells the developer what's actually going on, so we can give a meaningful message like return something like this. So this way, we can catch the cases when something is not quite right and then exit our function instead of wasting time for it to continue working on something that we don't want it to do. Next, I want to quickly spend a few minutes talking about a concept in Python known as docstrings. Docstrings are basically a way for us to create little bits of documentation as we are coding along in our function or in our other blocks of code. Now, previously we have seen that when we use other functions like the ones that were ready to find by Python like the length functions, you can see that as soon as I open my parentheses or brackets, I can see this little piece of documentation that tells me what this function is actually going to do, namely return the number of items in a container. So how can we create the same kind of documentation for the functions that we write? Well, we could do that using docstrings. The docstrings has to go as the first line after the declaration. So here we have defined the name of our function, the inputs, and then after the colon, the first indented line will be the docstring. But that's not it. You also have to use 3 of these quotation marks, and it's in between these 3 quotation marks that you can write your documentation. We could write something like, well, what is this format name function going to do? What would we want our future selves or another user who is using this function to know about? Well, it's going to take a first and last name and format it. Notice how with docstrings you can actually write strings and that are multiple line. Normally, if I was to create a normal string, let's say, I don't know, a is equal to a string, if I hit the enter key, I'm going to get a warning because it's going to interpret this as the end of this line, and it won't see the closing quotation mark as being a part of this string, but when we use a doc string we can write as many lines as we want and it will be interpreted all as the same thing altogether, as if it was fitted onto the same line like this. Now that we have added our doc string, it's time to see what it looks like. Now, if I call this function format name and I open up the brackets, you can see that the text we wrote here now gets populated in the documentation. It takes the first and last name and formats it to return the title case version of the name. So this is a way for you to able to start documenting your functions and giving each function a little bit of explainer. Have a go at adding doc strings to other functions that you have created and see it shows up when you call your functions. So that's all about today's video. Consider subscribing and join our WhatsApp community and Instagram, which link is given in the description. So until next video, take care and bye bye.